The conference room smelled faintly of whiteboard markers and stale coffee, a scent I'd come to associate with humiliation. My colleagues were already there, smiling too wide, laughing too loud, tossing around technical jargon I had helped decode, debug, and perfect while I carried their coffee and typed their notes. "Alice, can you fetch the graphs?" Marielle, the team lead, said without looking at me. Her smirk carried the weight of every condescending remark I'd endured since joining the lab. I set the papers down on the table, my hands steady, my mind quiet. They didn't know, none of them did, that the very equation they were about to present at the department symposium, the one they called groundbreaking, was something I had filed under my own name months ago. The patent announcement would go live at noon, and by the time they realized it, every brag, every claim, every smug comment would crumble like the coffee-stained lab notebooks I'd once used as shields. I glanced around the room, their faces glowing with excitement, oblivious. They thought they owned the discovery. They thought they were untouchable. I smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried years of overlooked effort, quiet endurance, and patient scheming. And for the first time, I felt the sharp, exhilarating weight of power, my power. The lights in the lab flickered as I set my bag down and pulled out my laptop, fingers hovering above the keyboard. For years I had been just Alice. Alice the assistant, Alice the note-taker, Alice the one everyone assumed would fade into irrelevance while they wrote their papers, claimed their glory, and accepted their awards. I had stayed quiet, nodded, smiled, made small talk in the cafeteria, and perfected my equations in secret. I had logged every late night, every extra calculation, every anomaly they ignored. I had been invisible by design, underestimated by practice, but today, at the stroke of noon, invisibility would turn into revelation. The patent would go live, and the credit would belong to me, Alice the assistant, the quiet observer, the one no one had expected. I pressed a few final keys to schedule the automatic announcement. A soft ping confirmed it was set. My heart didn't race. It didn't thump. Instead, it beat with a deliberate calm, the kind of rhythm you only get when a plan is meticulously plotted and finally executed. By the time the symposium begins, the entire department, Marielle included, would see my name at the top of the patent. The weight of every sneer, every dismissive glance, every joke about my assistant duties would hit them all at once, like a quiet tidal wave crashing into a shore they thought was untouched. And I, Alice, would be standing not in the background, not beside them, but above them, holding the recognition that had been mine all along. I leaned back in my chair, fingers intertwined on the laptop, staring at the ceiling tiles as memories surfaced. Laughter in the lab that excluded me, whispered critiques about how Alice will never understand, meetings where my suggestions were ignored or misattributed, every instance of being overlooked. It had taken years to learn patience, to build knowledge in silence, to let ego and hubris mask my true intentions. I had no desire for revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't crave humiliation. I wanted justice, precision, acknowledgement. The kind that couldn't be argued with or rewritten. At 11:59 a.m., I closed my eyes briefly and whispered, "This is for every late night they didn't notice, every credit they took, every time they called me just Alice." At noon, the email would ping the entire department. My name would appear at the top of the patent. I would remain calm, smile politely, and let the silence speak for itself. Because this time, I wasn't just the assistant. I was the author of their so-called breakthrough. By the time the patent notification pinged into every inbox in the department, I was already at my station, pretending to recalibrate the spectrometer like nothing had happened. The lab smelled of disinfectant and burnt coffee, familiar and grounding. I glanced around subtly. Marielle's fingers hovered over her keyboard. She didn't notice the email yet, but I could see the faint crease forming between her brows, the prelude to panic. It was almost comical, seeing the poised, self-assured leader falter for the first time, unsure, like a performance without a script. Julian, her research partner, muttered something about needing to check a formula again, but his tone was sharp with tension I had never witnessed from him. Everyone's excitement evaporated into confusion, curiosity, and finally, quiet dismay. They hadn't anticipated that Alice, the assistant, the quiet one, the one they had dismissed, would actually be the registered owner of the core discovery. I sat back in my chair, hands folded neatly, pretending to review a sample. But my ears were tuned to every whispered conversation, every clicking keyboard, every shuffling of papers. I could hear Marielle finally murmur, "Wait, is this hers?" Her voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. Julian leaned closer, his face pale. How did she? The rest of the room froze, searching their own emails. Phones buzzed. Laptops pinged. The patent office confirmation was there, glaringly clear, officially mine. I had anticipated the shock, but not the disbelief that radiated like heat from every colleague. It was satisfying in a quiet, controlled way, not cruel, but inevitable. For years, I had watched them take credit for ideas I helped develop. I had smiled while they spoke at conferences, let them present our joint work as if my presence was a shadow in the background. And for years, I had endured their casual superiority, their whispers, their inside jokes about how Alice just files the forms. Today, those same inside jokes bounced back at them like echoes, sharp and unavoidable. Marielle finally stood, pacing slightly. Her heels clicked on the tiled floor, echoing across the lab. She paused and said, "Alice, why didn't you tell anyone about this?" I tilted my head, smiling softly, calm and deliberate. "I wasn't asked." She stopped mid-step. "Not asked." The incredulity in her voice was almost painful. "You've worked with us for years. You could have contributed, you could," I interrupted gently. "I contributed every day. But no one saw my contributions, Marielle. I wasn't invited to co-author. I wasn't asked for insight. I wasn't considered a peer. I was just Alice. Assistant. Invisible. Until today." Her lips pressed together. Julian looked like he wanted to argue, to dismiss me again, but even he paused, realizing that the documents on the table didn't lie. The patent office confirmation, dated months ago, bore my name, my signature. Legally, technically, morally, it was mine. "Do you understand what this means?" I asked quietly. "This isn't just recognition. This is ownership. Control over the research. Decisions on publishing, licensing, and future development. Every step you've bragged about, every paper you've cited as yours, rests partly on something I own." The room was silent except for the soft hum of the fume hood. Their shock was palpable, a tangible weight pressing against the air. I could see their minds racing, realizing that the playful dominance they assumed over me, the jokes, the dismissals, the subtle social manipulations, had blinded them to something crucial. And now, they had no defense. Marielle's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. This isn't fair," she whispered, voice quivering with genuine fear. "We didn't know," I shook my head, smiling faintly. "No. You chose not to notice. You were too busy being first authors, presenters, and the stars of the lab to acknowledge that your foundation relied on someone you dismissed. That's not unfair. That's oversight. And oversight has consequences." Julian finally muttered, We could contest it." I met his eyes directly, steady and calm. "You could. But everything was filed correctly. All legal requirements met. Every form, every signature, every timestamp, mine. You can dispute it, waste time, energy, reputation. Or you can accept it and move forward. Your choice." Marielle's face flushed red. I could feel the air thickening with anger, embarrassment, and disbelief. "All these years, you watched and did nothing?" she asked. "You let us take credit?" I leaned back, fingers interlaced. "I did nothing, publicly. But I watched carefully, yes. I learned. I recorded. I improved. I waited for the right moment. Because rushing wouldn't guarantee the result. Patience ensures permanence." The tension in the lab transformed, subtly, into something else. Not respect yet. Not admiration. Just recognition. Acknowledgement that Alice, quiet, overlooked, underestimated, had agency they had never considered. That she had authority. That their world of assumed superiority had a blind spot, one that I occupied. I reached into my bag, pulling out a notebook. Not the fancy leather kind. Not the one with a monogram. Just the spiral I had carried through years of unnoticed labor. "These are my notes from the early drafts of the equation," I said, placing it on the table. The scribbles, calculations, margin annotations, highlighted areas, and refinements were all there. Every iteration. Every error corrected. Every insight added. Every breakthrough you claimed as collaborative, I recorded, verified, and protected. The patent is the legal manifestation of that work. Recognition finally catches up to reality. A quiet murmur passed through the room. I saw the edges of guilt forming in their expressions, subtle shifts as they processed that their authority, their perceived dominance, had rested on my silent labor. No one spoke. No one dared argue. Because arguments would crumble against evidence, facts, and meticulous planning. I continued softly, I never wanted revenge. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted the work to have its rightful owner. That's it. Today, I am no longer invisible. And the moment the announcement is public, everyone, our peers, the department, the research community, will know who holds the innovation, who holds the credit, who holds the future of this discovery. Marielle sank into her chair, a hand pressed to her forehead. Julian's shoulders slumped. Even some of the other lab members, quiet observers themselves, stared at me with a mix of surprise and awe. They had seen Alice fade into corners, fetch coffee, record data, remain patient, and now quietly, she was the center. She was the owner. She was the authority. I tapped the table lightly. There's a symposium in 2 weeks. I expect full cooperation in preparing the presentation. We move forward as a team, but credit will be properly assigned. The work is mine legally, yes, but ethically, we rebuild together. Collaboration works only when boundaries are recognized. I glanced at them all, letting the words sink in. No shouting. No gloating. Just clarity, precision, inevitability. Marielle's voice came out in a whisper, Alice. I held up a hand, stopping her. Call me Alice. Or Nora. Either works. But remember, never underestimate the quiet ones again. As I turned back to my desk, opening the laptop to review the next steps in publication, I felt a calm satisfaction settle in. Years of invisibility had refined me. Years of dismissal had sharpened me. And today, in the quiet control of facts, timelines, and legal authority, I had transformed the narrative from one of mockery to one of recognition. By the time noon struck, the announcement went live. The patent bore my name at the top. The department's inboxes flooded. The whispers grew louder, frantic, and then, in perfect rhythm, respect. The room that had once laughed at my coffee orders now buzzed with acknowledgement that Alice, the assistant, was no longer background. She was author, owner, innovator. And as I leaned back, the faintest smile touched my lips. Not revenge, not malice, just justice, patient, deliberate, quiet, undeniable. Because I had waited. I had watched. I had acted. And finally, the world saw me. The hum of the lab was different now. Not the ordinary background noise of machines, but tense, charged, like electricity waiting to snap. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, through the walls, through every skeptical glance my colleagues tried to hide behind their masks of composure. It was surreal, watching them interact with the same space that had once been mine only in shadow. I wasn't invisible anymore, not in the slightest, and their discomfort only fueled the quiet smile tugging at my lips. I moved slowly, deliberately, checking a few measurements, nodding at my assistant colleagues, letting them feel the shift in authority. The moment they'd all been blind to, the fact that Alice was capable, prepared, patient, and legally in control, was unfolding like a slow, mesmerizing tide. Marielle approached me first, her heels clicking against the polished tiles. Alice. She faltered. The words were meant to challenge me, to regain some perceived dominance, but they faltered, crumbling under the weight of undeniable reality. You filed the patent, she whispered, eyes wide, voice trembling between disbelief and panic. I looked at her calmly, almost tenderly, letting the years of quiet observation show in my eyes. Yes. I filed it, I said, voice soft but precise, carrying more weight than any shouting ever could. She blinked rapidly, like the truth was a bright light burning through the fog she had always relied upon to mask her mistakes. Julian crossed his arms, leaning against the lab counter. You can't just take credit for the work we all contributed to, he said, trying to inject authority into his words, but failing utterly. I tilted my head, letting him see the faintest spark of amusement, the patience of someone who had waited too long for reckoning. Oh, I contributed, I said softly, more than anyone here, including you. I observed every calculation, corrected every oversight, ensured every dataset was accurate. And while you were busy performing in front of committees and conferences, I made sure the foundation you relied upon was solid. That foundation is legally mine now. The color drained from his face. Julian had always considered himself untouchable, a sharp mind overshadowed only by ego. Now, standing in front of him, I could see the first cracks, subtle but undeniable. The kind that whispered silently, "You miscalculated." I walked toward the table, deliberately slow, letting my steps echo. "Let me make one thing clear," I said, each word measured, deliberate. "This isn't about revenge. This isn't about humiliation. This is about recognition. For years, I've been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed as an assistant, as someone who helps rather than leads. But every report, every dataset, every formula you bragged about, was built on work I meticulously documented and protected. The patent is simply the formal acknowledgement of what's always been true." Marielle's hands trembled as she pressed them against the table. "But why now?" she asked, voice almost breaking. Why didn't you speak up earlier?" I shook my head slowly, almost pityingly. "Because timing matters. Strategy matters. Patience matters. If I had revealed myself earlier, I would have risked their dismissal, their disregard, their dismissal of my abilities again. I needed a moment where the truth couldn't be ignored. That moment is now." Her eyes widened as realization dawned. "You planned this?" she asked, the word a mixture of awe, fear, and reluctant admiration. I nodded once. Every step, every misstep they made, every assumption they had about me, about my abilities, about my role, they all contributed to the precision of today. You see, being underestimated is a tool. They handed me the advantage they never realized existed. Julian's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming against the counter. "You're ruthless," he muttered, voice low. It wasn't an accusation. It was acknowledgement, almost admiration he refused to voice fully. I smiled faintly. "I'm not ruthless. I'm deliberate." The lab had grown quiet. Even the junior researchers, the ones who had looked up to the so-called stars of the team, were watching me with a mixture of shock and tentative respect. Some whispered to each other, exchanging glances that said without words, "She's formidable. She's always been here." I opened my notebook slowly, letting the spiral edge catch the light. Every page was a testament to years of unnoticed work, calculations, refinements, experiments, corrections, observations. I placed it on the table where they could see it. These are my notes. Every step of the process. Every insight. Every correction. Every derivation you claimed as collaboration, as joint work, it's documented here. The patent is simply the formal acknowledgement of the work that these pages prove is mine. The room went still. Marielle's mouth opened and closed, no words forming. Julian's face was pale. Even the quiet researchers at the back were leaning forward, reading over shoulders, taking in the tangible proof of what had been invisible for so long. I leaned on the edge of the table, my presence calm, unshakable. I've learned a lot in this lab. About research. About science. But more importantly, about people. And I've learned that recognition follows not those who shout the loudest, but those who are patient, meticulous, and prepared. I have waited. And today I act. Marielle finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alice, this changes everything." I nodded, letting the statement hang in the air. It did. Everything had changed. Not just for me, but for the team, for the lab, for every colleague who had underestimated me. I pressed a few keys on my laptop. A quiet chime confirmed the patent announcement had been distributed to the department and affiliated research institutions. I could see the ripple of shock across the room. Emails were being opened. Notifications popped up. People murmured. The ones who had mocked me, belittled me, ignored me, they were confronting reality in real time. Julian muttered something under his breath. We didn't know." I shook my head slowly. "You chose not to know. That's the difference. You assumed you were in control. And now, control has shifted quietly, invisibly, irreversibly." Marielle sank into her chair, shoulders slumping, the color draining from her face. "Alice." I raised a hand gently, stopping her. "Call me Alice. Or Nora. Either works." The day stretched on, sunlight filtering weakly through the lab's tall windows, yet inside, the air was heavy with whispered panic. My colleagues, those who had laughed at my coffee runs, dismissed my ideas, and called me just Alice, had started to realize that the shift wasn't temporary, wasn't a fluke, and wasn't open to negotiation. I watched them navigate the revelation with a kind of delicate desperation, a tension I had anticipated but still savored quietly. They were learning something that years of arrogance had never prepared them for, that someone they'd overlooked could wield authority without theatrics, without shouting, without needing their validation. Marielle hovered near the main workstation, eyes darting to every notification ping, every email notification, every subtle ripple that indicated the patent announcement was circulating. Her hands twisted nervously in front of her, and I could see her mind racing, how to reclaim credit, how to assert dominance, how to regain the sense of control she had always believed belonged to her. But there was no reclaiming control, not from someone who had quietly claimed it long before they even noticed. Julian, on the other hand, seemed lost in calculation. Not equations or data this time, but probabilities. He leaned against a counter, tapping his pen against a notebook with more force than necessary. She owns the patent, he murmured to nobody in particular, almost in disbelief. I mean legally everything she's saying, it's, his sentence faltered unfinished, as if the words themselves recognized futility. I let the silence stretch, my calm demeanor a mirror to their escalating anxiety. A small group of junior researchers, the ones who had often huddled quietly with notebooks at the back of the lab, glanced at each other, uncertain whether to speak or stay silent. Their eyes, however, betrayed curiosity tinged with admiration. Even in their quiet, hesitant ways, they understood that Alice, the assistant they had assumed would fade quietly into irrelevance, was now the undeniable pivot of authority. They hadn't been part of the mockery, but they had observed it, and they had waited. And now, they could see the power of patience, precision, and strategic endurance. I walked slowly toward the central workstation, letting my presence fill the space. We have a lot to prepare for, I said, my voice calm but carrying enough authority to quiet the murmurs. The patent announcement is public, and the department is aware. We need to draft a presentation that reflects proper ownership and contribution. I glanced at Marielle, who had frozen mid-step. Her smirk, once so confident, was gone. The color drained from her cheeks as she muttered, I thought I had time to discuss this. I shook my head slightly. You had time to notice. You chose not to. That choice has consequences. Today, the consequences are evident. Tomorrow, the department will know the truth. A sharp intake of breath came from Julian. This could affect funding, he said, voice tight with unease. Our grants, our publications. If they see the patent is under your name, he trailed off, realizing he couldn't finish the sentence. He had assumed dominance, visibility, and credibility came naturally. He had underestimated the quiet architect in their midst. I nodded, almost sympathetically. It will affect funding. But it will affect it correctly. I will ensure our team receives the recognition and resources it deserves, without compromising ethical or legal integrity. What we have built together will continue, but it will be guided by truth, not by ego. Marielle's hands gripped the edge of the workstation. You don't understand, she said sharply, but not convincingly. The department, the awards, we can't, she paused as her voice faltered under the undeniable weight of reality. We can't just accept this. You can, I said, placing a hand gently on the counter between us. You can either adapt, or you can resist and waste energy on something that cannot be undone. The patent is mine. The recognition is mine. And the work itself, well, that belongs to science, as it should. You will still have your contributions acknowledged, but the legal and ethical foundation rests with me. That is not open to debate. She stared at me, a mix of frustration, disbelief, and something resembling awe. Julian muttered something about consulting the department chair, as if higher authority could reverse a carefully executed legal reality. I didn't respond. There was nothing to respond to. The truth was documented, notarized, time-stamped, and undeniable. The junior researchers began approaching cautiously, notebooks and laptops in hand. Alice, Nora, one of them said softly. Do you want us to help draft the presentation? Their tone was tentative but respectful, recognizing the shift in authority, acknowledging the quiet strategist who had patiently claimed what was hers. I smiled faintly. Yes. I want your input, your observations, your careful attention. Collaboration is most effective when everyone knows their contributions are valued and recognized. Marielle opened her mouth again, likely to protest, but the room collectively leaned in, the unspoken acknowledgement of her loss of dominance hanging heavily in the air. She closed her mouth, pressed her lips together, and for a moment, I saw her processing the new hierarchy. Julian, too, had stopped drumming his fingers, his eyes on the floor as he digested the reality. I turned back to my workstation, my calm deliberate movements a subtle reminder that the center of this room, and this lab, had shifted. The patent announcement was only the first step. The department symposium, the emails, the recognition, all of it would follow. But today the foundation was laid. Alice, the assistant, underestimated, overlooked, invisible, was now the undeniable authority. I glanced at the clock. 3 hours had passed since the email pinged through everyone's inbox. By now, the whispers had traveled beyond our lab, reaching administration, other departments, and the research committees. People were emailing, calling, arranging meetings. I didn't feel pride. Not yet. It wasn't about ego. It was about acknowledgement. Justice measured in quiet, deliberate increments. Marielle approached one final time, her voice soft, almost broken. Alice. I'm sorry, she said, a rare moment of vulnerability. I looked at her, letting the words resonate. Apologies are not necessary. Understanding is. Recognition is what counts. And today, recognition is evident. I returned to my station and opened my laptop, reviewing calculations, plotting next steps, preparing for the symposium presentation. The room's tension gradually shifted into a productive energy, a reluctant but necessary acknowledgement that Alice had always been a central figure in this research, even when they refused to see it. I took a moment to review the follow-up tasks for the patent, ensuring that all documentation was complete, permissions filed, and credit accurately reflected. The work wasn't over, it never is, but the foundation had been firmly established. I had claimed what was rightfully mine, without public spectacle, without drama. The quiet triumph of years of persistence and diligence was finally tangible. In the evening, as the lab emptied and the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat alone at my workstation, reflecting. The journey had been long years of unnoticed effort, of invisible labor, of silent observation. Yet, in the patient accumulation of knowledge, strategy, and subtle action, I had transformed my position from overlooked assistant to recognized innovator. The patent was more than a legal document. It was a symbol of endurance, intelligence, and quiet resilience. And in that moment of stillness, I understood something profound. The true measure of success isn't the applause, the accolades, or the recognition itself. It's the awareness that you claimed what was yours, with precision, patience, and unwavering resolve, without compromising integrity or dignity. That is power. That is victory. That is Alice. As I powered down my laptop and stepped out of the lab, the city lights flickered around me, soft and luminous. The world had shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. The colleagues who had mocked me, underestimated me, and dismissed me would never see me the same way again. I had proven that invisibility does not equate to weakness, that silence can be strategic, and that patience and preparation are often more formidable than arrogance and entitlement. Walking through the quiet streets, I felt a serenity I had never known before. I wasn't celebrating in the traditional sense. I wasn't gloating. The recognition, the patent, the authority, they were gratifying, yes, but the deeper satisfaction came from the knowledge that my actions were deliberate, precise, and inevitable. I had been underestimated, mocked, overlooked, and dismissed, but I had turned all of it into quiet, undeniable triumph. For the first time in my career, I wasn't merely seen. I was acknowledged. I was respected. I was in control. And the world from this point forward would remember the name Alice, not as a footnote, not as an assistant, but as the innovator who quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably claimed her rightful place. The morning of the symposium arrived like a tide, slow but unstoppable. The city outside the lab glimmered with the soft hum of weekday life, cars, pedestrians, distant sirens, but inside, the energy was electric, charged with anticipation and quiet anxiety. I arrived early, my laptop and notes carefully organized, my presentation rehearsed not for applause, but for clarity and impact. As I entered the main hall, the subtle shift in attention was immediate. People who had once overlooked me, mocked me, whispered behind my back, now looked at me with a mixture of surprise, uncertainty, and the first flickers of respect. My name was on the patent. My authority was now visible, undeniable, and I could see it ripple through the room like a current. Marielle and Julien were already there, seated near the front, faces tight with tension, their previous confidence replaced with cautious calculation. They exchanged glances that were equal parts disbelief and reluctant acknowledgement. Even from a distance, I could see their minds spinning, weighing how to salvage dignity, reputation, and credibility. I didn't rush them. I didn't need to. Power, when patiently claimed, often reveals itself quietly, in moments like this, before words are spoken. I set up my laptop, connected the projector, and took a deep breath. The audience, department heads, colleagues, visiting scholars, watched with polite curiosity. They had received the email, seen the patent, but seeing me now, standing confidently at the podium, brought a new dimension to the revelation. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer just the assistant. I was Alice, the patent holder, the innovator, the quiet force that had been underestimated for far too long. When I began speaking, my voice was calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of years of silent observation and meticulous preparation. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. I am here to present our latest research findings, specifically the core equation and methodology that underpin the recently filed patent under my name. While this has been a collaborative effort, the intellectual property has been registered to reflect the contributions accurately and ethically. I let each word hang for a moment, scanning the room, watching subtle shifts in posture, watching Marielle and Julien stiffen, their earlier smirks replaced with strained composure. The presentation flowed smoothly. I guided the audience through the derivations, the refinements, the experimental validations. Every slide, every chart, every carefully annotated figure was mine, meticulously prepared, and presented without embellishment or unnecessary dramatics. The focus was on clarity, precision, and undeniable evidence. Every equation I explained, every nuance I highlighted, subtly reinforced that the work was not just collective, it was grounded in the diligence, insight, and foresight that I had contributed silently for years. Questions came from the audience, probing, analytical, at times challenging. I answered each with calm authority, referencing data, methodology, and experimental results. I could feel the room shift, subtly, with every explanation. The quiet respect that had been absent in the lab now manifested in nods, attentive expressions, and notes being scribbled faster than before. People realized that Alice, the assistant they had dismissed, was articulate, knowledgeable, and in command of every aspect of the work. Marielle finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Alice. I mean Nora, the level of detail, the precision, it's exceptional. I nodded, acknowledging her comment without emotion. Thank you. The accuracy of our work is essential. Recognition is meaningful only when it is accurate, and today we present not just the findings, but the rightful attribution of intellectual contribution. Julien tried to interject, attempting to reclaim some control, but the audience, having observed the patent and now the presentation, were clearly aligned with reality. His words faltered, unconvincing, as I maintained eye contact with the room, calm and unshakable. Authority had shifted, quietly and decisively. After the symposium, I walked through the hall, receiving congratulations, handshakes, and even tentative apologies. It was subtle, not theatrical, but effective. Recognition flowed in the quiet ways I preferred: emails, messages, direct acknowledgments. The individuals who had mocked me for years were learning a vital lesson: invisibility is not weakness. Underestimation is not security. Patience and strategy are power. Back at the lab later that afternoon, the atmosphere had transformed. Junior researchers approached me not with timid hesitation but with genuine curiosity and respect. Marielle and Julien were still present, navigating their new roles under my authority, their expressions a blend of acknowledgement and lingering resentment. I didn't push them. I allowed the space to adjust naturally. Leadership, I knew, is most effective when it is felt rather than demanded. I took a moment to review the follow-up tasks for the patent, ensuring that all documentation was complete, permissions filed, and credit accurately reflected. The work wasn't over, it never is, but the foundation had been firmly established. I had claimed what was rightfully mine, without public spectacle, without drama. The quiet triumph of years of persistence and diligence was finally tangible. In the evening, as the lab emptied and the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat alone at my workstation, reflecting. The journey had been long years of unnoticed effort, of invisible labor, of silent observation. Yet, in the patient accumulation of knowledge, strategy, and subtle action, I had transformed my position from overlooked assistant to recognized innovator. The patent was more than a legal document. It was a symbol of endurance, intelligence, and quiet resilience. And in that moment of stillness, I understood something profound. The true measure of success isn't the applause, the accolades, or the recognition itself. It's the awareness that you claimed what was yours, with precision, patience, and unwavering resolve, without compromising integrity or dignity. That is power. That is victory. That is Alice. As I powered down my laptop and stepped out of the lab, the city lights flickered around me, soft and luminous. The world had shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. The colleagues who had mocked me, underestimated me, and dismissed me would never see me the same way again. I had proven that invisibility does not equate to weakness, that silence can be strategic, and that patience and preparation are often more formidable than arrogance and entitlement. Walking through the quiet streets, I felt a serenity I had never known before. I wasn't celebrating in the traditional sense, I wasn't gloating. The recognition, the patent, the authority, they were gratifying, yes, but the deeper satisfaction came from the knowledge that my actions were deliberate, precise, and inevitable. I had been underestimated, mocked, overlooked, and dismissed, but I had turned all of it into quiet, undeniable triumph. For the first time in my career, I wasn't merely seen. I was acknowledged. I was respected. I was in control. And the world from this point forward would remember the name Alice, not as a footnote, not as an assistant, but as the innovator who quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably claimed her rightful place. The lab was quiet that morning, a stillness unlike any I had experienced before. The chaos of recognition, the murmurs, the whispered apologies, and the stunned faces had faded into something calmer, subtler. Even Marielle and Julian moved through the space with a newfound restraint, cautious but attentive, their earlier arrogance tempered by undeniable truth. The patent had shifted the balance, not with theatrics, but with irrefutable clarity. And I felt it, finally fully, the weight of years of endurance, diligence, and unseen labor lifting from my shoulders, replaced by the steady, satisfying weight of rightful ownership. I sat at my workstation, fingers tracing the edge of my notebook, the spiral worn from years of nightly calculations, careful observations, and methodical annotations. I remembered the first day I had stepped into this lab, young and eager to learn yet painfully aware of my invisibility. They had laughed at my early questions, dismissed my suggestions, and called me just the assistant with smug amusement. At the time, I had smiled politely, nodded, and carried on, hiding a quiet determination that had been growing like a slow, persistent current beneath the surface. I had endured their condescension, their casual superiority, the way they flaunted their authority while leaving me to shuffle in the margins. Each sneer, each dismissive remark, each subtle erasure of my contributions became a thread in a fabric I was quietly weaving. Not for vengeance, not for spectacle, but for inevitability, the eventual recognition of the work, the intellect, and the patience that had always been mine. The patent had been the culmination, yes, but the journey had been much longer, more intricate, and infinitely more satisfying. The symposium had passed. The department had absorbed the news, reactions ranging from muted shock to cautious respect. Colleagues who had once ignored my presence now sought my guidance, my input, my collaboration. And the ones who had mocked, dismissed, and belittled me, Marielle and Julian included, had begun the slow, inevitable process of recalibration, recognizing that Alice, the assistant, was no longer invisible, no longer irrelevant, no longer underestimated. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet hum of the lab envelop me. There was a serene satisfaction in the silence. No applause, no fanfare, just the calm aftermath of justice carefully, deliberately executed. I realized in that moment that my triumph was not measured in external validation, but in the quiet certainty that I had acted with precision, strategy, and integrity. I had turned invisibility into power, dismissal into recognition, patience into authority. Marielle approached cautiously, her voice softer than I had ever heard. "Alice. Nora. I want to apologize," she said, her tone tentative, unsure, yet genuine. "I underestimated you. I didn't see your contributions." I nodded slowly, meeting her gaze. Acknowledgement is more important than apology. Today, That acknowledgement is evident. I hope it guides your future interactions with your colleagues and students alike. Underestimation has consequences, but it also teaches lessons. Julian remained in the background, silent but attentive, a small nod betraying that he too had absorbed the lesson. Their expressions were tempered not by fear, but by the understanding that authority, respect, and recognition were earned and maintained through action, diligence, and integrity, not entitlement. I rose from my chair and moved toward the large whiteboard at the center of the lab. It bore the equations, the derivations, the corrections, and the refinements that had been my silent labor for years. Running my fingers over the faint marker lines, I felt the weight of memory, late nights, careful corrections, unacknowledged breakthroughs, patient observation. Each line told a story of persistence, resilience, and quiet mastery. As I erased a small section to adjust a final detail, I smiled. The lab was no longer just a place of work, it was a testament to endurance. A sanctuary where patience, intelligence, and careful planning had finally been recognized. The patent, the symposium, the acknowledgement, all were part of a larger story, a narrative I had authored quietly, meticulously, and invisibly for years. Later, as I gathered my bag to leave, I paused by the window. The city stretched below, lights shimmering in the early evening haze. I thought of all the moments I had been overlooked, all the times I had been told I was too quiet, too small, too insignificant. And I realized that those moments had not diminished me, they had refined me, honed my focus, sharpened my patience, and built a resolve that could not be shaken by arrogance or mockery. Walking through the quiet streets, I felt a deep, unwavering satisfaction. Recognition was no longer something to hope for, it was something I had claimed, carefully and deliberately. The world now knew the truth. The ones who had doubted, dismissed, or mocked me could not erase it. I had transformed the narrative from invisibility to authority, from dismissal to acknowledgement, from quiet endurance to cinematic triumph. And yet, the true victory lay not in the recognition itself, but in the quiet control I had maintained throughout. No theatrics, no public spectacle, just deliberate, strategic, and inevitable assertion of what was mine. That was power. That was triumph. That was justice. At home that evening, I placed the patent documents on my desk, glancing over the formal signatures and notarized stamps. Each one represented not just the culmination of work, but the culmination of patience, strategy, and silent determination. The journey from Alice the assistant to Alice the innovator had been long, intricate, and satisfying in a way that applause never could match. I thought back to the lab, to the faces of Marielle, Julian, and the others. I did not feel triumph over them. I felt satisfaction at the quiet, unarguable acknowledgement of reality. Their arrogance had been tempered not by confrontation, but by precision, patience, and inevitability. The lesson was clear: underestimate the quiet, and you invite an unstoppable reckoning. As night fell, I closed my laptop, dimmed the desk lamp, and leaned back in my chair. The city outside twinkled softly, distant and calm. I had walked through invisibility, endured dismissal, endured mockery, and emerged not with spectacle, but with quiet, undeniable triumph. The patent, the recognition, the acknowledgement, they were tangible, yes, but the deeper victory was the transformation within myself, from overlooked assistant to confident, acknowledged innovator, standing in the light of quiet justice. I whispered softly, almost to myself, I am Alice. I am seen. I am recognized. I am in control. And I will never be invisible again. The journey had been long, the path winding and careful, but the destination was clear. Justice had been claimed quietly, deliberately, and irrevocably. And for the first time in my life, I knew the full weight of true quiet triumph.